everyone, and welcome to this first episode of our Alumni Harvey Nash Leadership in Lockdown series of interviews. So over the coming weeks and months, we'll be interviewing and having some informal conversations with senior leaders across the public sectors to discuss how they have been navigating the impact of COVID and really what this has meant for how we think about leadership specifically in new and different and even perhaps quite unconventional ways. So with this in mind, I'm delighted to be joined today by Professor Sir David Eastwood, Vice-Chancellor of the University of Birmingham. Welcome, Sir David.
Oh, and it's my pleasure. Good to see you.
Great, fantastic. And thanks so much for investing some time today out of your busy diary to have a conversation with us here at Alumni Harvey Nash. So, David, you and I met quite some time ago, actually pre-COVID, sort of BC as it were, when I think the world was on a very different axis altogether, actually. And so the lockdown situation has lasted for approximately a year now. Can you talk to me through your experience of how you've navigated this last year, I suppose, both institutionally in terms of Birmingham and individually as well?
Yes. Interestingly, I was in Hong Kong first week in January 2020, and Hong Kong was beginning to report what was going on in Wuhan. I remember reading the reports in the South China Morning Post and thinking, yeah, this is probably significant, but really didn't think, as many people didn't think, that it would impact us, here in the UK and here in Europe. So yes, it's been a year. It's been a year none of us had anticipated, and none of us actually planned for. And I've reflected on that, and I think the fact that we hadn't planned for it is probably advantageous. If we'd thought that there was a playbook for the pandemic, we'd have all have reached for the playbook, we'd have started running our organisations in accordance with the playbook, and it wouldn't have worked. So I think for many of us, we planned for other kinds of emergencies, other potential disasters. But I think we did better because we were responding to events, we were responding to unprecedented circumstances. I think we all did substantially similar things back in March, April of 2020. We moved all or most of our businesses online. That was true of the University of Birmingham. It was also true of the major pension scheme that I was chairing at the time, and other organisations I was involved with. And I think in most organisations, that worked well. I think we were all surprised, actually, at the resilience of our organisations and the speed, and I think the imagination with which we were able to pivot, which was, of course, then the term we used, from normal operations to essentially online operations. I think the challenge that we all had then, and the challenge that we still live with, is for how long will this go on? And when will the future start? And I think if you think back to March, April last year, I think most organisations thought by the summer or the autumn of 2020, we would be back to something much closer to conventional operations, and the future, whatever the future would be, would begin then. And the fact that it hasn't played out like that has created, I think, a whole series of other and new problems. So, as you say, Owen, we're a year in. I think organisations are tired. I think people are tired. I think that key question of when the future starts is still an open question. And the other thing I think that we're all experiencing is early on, we ran very effectively on what I would describe as the accumulated capital of working face to face. We knew the people we were engaging with, and we could do so in the novel form of engaging virtually for almost all the time. And we were surprised how well it worked. By the autumn, not only is this mode of interaction a somewhat desiccated form of interaction, I think we also started seeing in lots of businesses what we were missing. It's hard to be creative operating like this. It's hard to deal with issues which are complex and subtle. It's essentially, this is a transactional medium. It works well actually doing transactional things, and I'm sure we will continue doing that in the future. But I think in all of our organisations that we were missing that kind of creativity, we were missing that sort of buzz. And also we were beginning to see the consequences of people's exhaustion and the impact actually of people's home circumstances and domestic circumstances. So people could manage for 2 or 3 months, but managing for a year, managing when you're homeschooling, managing when you've got caring responsibilities, managing when you might yourself be feeling fragile, all of those things are taking their toll. So what do I think now? I think now a lot of organisations are operating reasonably effectively. We've learnt new ways of doing. We're operating suboptimally. And I think all of us are beginning to plan for what we think the future will be and how our organisations will, we hope, thrive, but if not thrive, certainly survive in the future.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Sir David. And it's an interesting point, isn't it? Because it's the organisational resilience, and then it's also the resilience of people. And I think, I stepped into a leadership role a couple of years ago now in terms of leading the higher education practice here at Alumni Harvey Nash. And actually, never has there been more of a test of kind of resilience of leadership in an early leadership role than I could have ever wished for. So yeah. I suppose I'm really interested from you, Sir David, how does one lead visibly and kind of influence visibly in times like this? Have you found that your own role has become constrained, or have you found that there are other ways of being visible that you weren't aware of before?
I mean, if you take my role as Vice-Chancellor of one of the largest universities in the country, quite a lot of what I did, I ceased to be able to do. Quite a lot of what I did was out on the road. Quite a lot of what I did was being the public face of the university. And much of that is on hold. So quite an important part of the role disappeared. I think the organisation probably became more reliant upon me, more reliant upon my example, more reliant on that sense of confidence, that sense of yes, we can, that I think as Chief Executive, you can and must give to your organisation. But I made a call very early on. In lockdown 1, this university was still operating in some areas, particularly our medical research. We had a number of people on campus from security, from cleaning, but much of the campus was locked down. But I made the decision to be as present on campus as I could be, to be seen, to be around, to talk to the people who were coming in. At that stage, actually not knowing what risks they might have been taking. I mean, this campus is an incredibly safe place now. But early on, I mean, nobody quite knew. And I think it was really important the Chief Executive was seen to be there, seen to be supportive, seen to be appreciative. And I think different leaders obviously operate in different ways. But I find it is important to have that sort of sense of connection, to have that sense of being there. Otherwise, if you're not careful, I think the organisation, the business starts to come and feel a bit remote, and your decision making can, I think, be impaired by that sense of it's been more of an exercise and less of a reality. So for me, being present and being seen to be present was important. Being seen to be confident around how we would take decisions rapidly was also important. And also empowering the team. This is not about heroic leadership. This is about teams stepping forward. And I'm fortunate. I've been running the University of Birmingham now for 12 years. I know the university well. I know a lot of the people in the university well, because I think, as in all big organisations, what the pandemic did was it made you dependent on quite a lot of people in the middle of the organisation who had to step forward. And I think if you were new to the role, it would have been much harder to understand, well, what is their capability? Are they really up for this? Whereas if you know the organisation well, if you've been in it for a long time, if you understand this DNA, I think it's easier to say, yeah, I think that's a safe move on, or no, actually, I think we need to put some more capacity and capability in there. And the other thing I think that has been really important for us is getting the communication right. I remember years ago when I read a report on the Christchurch earthquake and the damage to the university in Christchurch, and they handled it really, really well. If you read the report, the thing that they found hardest was communicating when there was nothing to say, when the communication is, we are working the problem. And that was with me right at the beginning, that it is important to communicate. It's important not to over-communicate, but colleagues want to understand, where they are, where the organisation is, from is their job secure right through to, and what can I do to be helpful? So we've spent a lot of time here working on communications. We've got a great comms team. And I think that's made a big difference in a community of, 8,500 staff and 36,000 students to be able to give them the sense of security that the university is okay. We're doing pretty well in spite of all, and they're understanding what they can contribute and what we don't need them to contribute.
It's really interesting, actually, and I think that from my perspective in terms of executive search, I mean, obviously we work with a range of different universities, research institutions, non-profit organisations, and we place people, I suppose, on a day-to-day basis. And I think that what candidates value has changed since the pandemic is something that I've noticed. And then I think what organisations value and identify in leadership has also changed. And I wondered how you'd reflect on that as well, David. Has COVID sort of made us more empathetic leaders, more resilient?
I certainly think it's placed a high premium on resilience. It's placed a high premium on being sympathetic. I think different leaders draw on different things. I've been in major leadership roles in higher education for over 20 years now. And it's surprising, actually, how when you're trying to think through problems and work through problems, you've got that sort of hinterland of experience that you find yourself almost subconsciously actually drawing on it and drawing on, situations which obviously are not like this and don't have the scale of challenge that this has, but they have had some of the elements of that. But I think it's, it has been important that people in senior leadership positions, have been able to show resilience throughout this period. I think one of the other challenges, though, that that leaders and leadership groups have now is organisations are tired. People in organisations are tired, and delivering on a day-by-day basis is still a real challenge. So organisations are running hot. There's not much spare capacity, if any spare capacity. On the other hand, I think it's imperative that leaders think about, well, what next? What is the future going to look like? How can we thrive in that new world? And communicating that is really hard, because, a lot of people will say, can you please give us a break? Both metaphorically and literally, actually. It's really hard to do the day job. It's hard to do the day job with all of the other things which I'm having to cope with personally and domestically. Isn't tomorrow the time to think about the future? But, I know that if this university does really well post the pandemic, then we will benefit from that for a decade. If we get it wrong, if we're slow, then we will pay the price for that. So one of my responsibilities as leader is to try to think through with my leadership team the priorities for the future, think through the strategy, think through what will come back, what will persist from the new ways of doing, what higher education will look like, what research will look like, both nationally and globally, post-pandemic, and then communicate that to our colleagues in a way which is reassuring and not further destabilizing.
Yes, it's a real challenge, isn't it? And I think what COVID has done in many ways, from my perspective, and that kind of top-down view of the sector, I suppose, is that it's almost intensified and kind of amplified every former aspect of leadership, to mean that you really need to get communication right. I think that's the thing that has really changed around my role, and I can imagine roles within the sector and within universities as well. What type of advice, if any, Sir David, would you give individuals that are kind of stepping up in their leadership careers within the sector, I suppose, that might be at that kind of sub-executive level that are looking to develop? Is there anything that COVID has changed around that, or sort of additional advice that you'd give individuals on that basis?
Certainly all of the organisations I'm familiar with, so I'm not just talking here about universities or higher education, have discovered that they can do things much more quickly than they ever thought. I think that means that, I think for all organisations, the pace of change will be more rapid. The facility of change, the ability to do change, will probably be greater. And that's both an advantage and a risk. The advantage is obvious. The risk is that you make mistakes. So I think the challenge that university leaders often used to face was, how will I get this through? How will I win hearts and minds? That challenge is probably less now, and will be less. So therefore, you've got to think, is it the right strategy? Am I doing the right thing? Because that kind of self-writing capacity of universities and other big organisations may well be diminished. I think the other thing that I would say to anybody who is thinking about stepping up into leadership is that the fundamentals still matter. If you are going to lead a university like Birmingham, this is the place of education and research. You excel at education and research, and you do a whole range of other things, from the civic mission of the university through to the global mission of the university. But those fundamentals still matter. So don't take your eye off the ball, because if you're not a great university for research, if you're not a wonderful place of education, then you'll be found out downstream. So there is a bit of a danger that what you do is you're looking at the wrong dials on the dashboard. So there's the speed on the rev counter, and keep your eye on those two things, and check the fuel gauge every now and then. So I think that's important. I think too. Well, a colleague of mine left Birmingham to become a pro Vice-Chancellor at another university, and as we were chatting as she was leaving, she said, "The most important thing you've ever said to me, David, was." In a leadership development meeting I was doing, and I said to someone that it was no part of my job to tell other people how difficult my job is. Now, what's interesting is I'd forgotten I'd even said it, but I sort of thought, yeah, it probably is the sort of thing I would have said. But I think there is a sort of self-denial in leadership. You can't indulge yourself as a leader of any organisation, and particularly as a Vice-Chancellor of big organisations, lots of deference. You've got a fancy title, you often dress up in fancy ways. But I think it's really important to understand that in the role as a leader, as a chief executive, the organisation is looking to you as its leader. And that's slightly different from looking to you as a person. And if you complicate that by allowing yourself to get in the way, by becoming needy, so you impose your needs on the organisation, then that was never a smart way of operating. But when organisations, are stressed and stretched as they are now, the needy leader is the last thing that an organisation can cope with. So, I think if you're thinking about stepping up into a vice-chancellorship, if you're thinking of stepping up into a chief executive role, I think you've got to ask yourself, the question you should have always asked yourself is this the right role for me? Is my ambition well matched to my ability? But also, I think, for some, you should ask, and is this the right time? Am I the right kind of leader for a pandemic? Am I the right kind of leader for the recovery from a global crisis? Or is my particular skill set, is my particular style as a leader better suited to different times? And that's not a statement of failure. It's not a statement of weakness. It's just recognizing different times demand a different kind of cocktail of leadership skills.
Indeed, I think the needy leader is a term that I'm going to coin now from now onwards, Sir David, and claim as my own, perhaps. But no, that's
you're more than welcome. More than welcome.
Thank you, indeed. And speaking of leadership, Sir David, I mean your retirement was recently announced. So what's next for you after Birmingham, and obviously after such an extensive and kind of decorated executive career as well?
It's a good question, and I think it will become clear. I'm going to be leading the university to the end of the calendar year, so I've said explicitly to the university it's business as usual, and will remain business as usual until the 31st of December. I'll be 63. I want to do some other things. I think I will end up with, at least I hope I'll end up with, a portfolio of interesting roles. I think probably the period where I do big exec jobs is now at an end, and so they will be non-exec roles. And obviously I spent a career in higher education, and I hope I'd be able to continue to make a contribution in higher education. But I've done other things. And I've been engaged in other sectors alongside, and I've learned a lot from that. I've gained a lot from that, and I hope I'll continue to be able to explore some other options outside higher education as well. It's interesting, you've been generous and said I've spent a long time doing this, and if I look back, it's 30 years since I became senior tutor at my Oxford college. Actually, it's quite a difficult time for that college. There is no substitute for experience in leadership. To be a good leader, there's something about innate capability. There's something about development and training over a period of time, and there's something about experience. And the interesting thing I've thought quite a lot about experience. The interesting thing about experience is it's not just time served. It's the way you do things, it's the way you reflect on things, and it's the way in which that experience then becomes a resource that you might be able to draw on at different times in different ways. And that's also been important to me in my own leadership, that people have been generous. They've asked me to do other things, which I've always found intellectually interesting, professionally challenging, and that keeps you learning as a leader. It keeps you reflecting as a leader, and I think it keeps you, relatively humble as a leader. Because the one thing I would always say, I do always say actually, in leadership development is that this is a role. I'm sitting here, I'm wearing a shirt and tie, I'm dressed as you would expect a Vice-Chancellor to be dressed because I'm playing a role. I now understand why actors dress. Even if it's in contemporary costume, they dress because they're playing a role. And leadership is about inhabiting a role. You do that better if you're trained, you do that better if you've got experience. And you do it even better if you're constantly challenging yourself to do better still.
The term role, I think, is a very kind of loaded term anyway, isn't it? So it's I think it's definitive in that sense. But so David, it's been a real pleasure speaking with you today, and thank you so much again for investing the time. I remember last time you and I met face to face properly, it was the hottest day I think in 2019. And I sort of moaned at the fact that I was wearing a suit in the place that we met, but I will never dare to do that again. I mean, what I would give to be sort of stifling in a woolen suit and sort of 90 degrees. But no, it's been a real pleasure as always, and we will stay in touch going forward. But thank you so much for being a part of our Leadership in Lockdown discussions. And our next Leadership in Lockdown discussion will be following this one. So please feel free to tune in on our social media pages, and we look forward to speaking again very soon.